Welcome to Statistic Learning Session. Welcome to Data Visualization Learning Session. Today, we'll be talking about practicing good ethics in data visualization. This is the second part of data visualization. We talked about first part in our last lesson. In this lesson, we'll examine one more case study regarding gun dates. This chart shows about gun dates that is related to 2005 law that was enacted where gun owners were allowed to carry or shoot someone if gun owner feels that deadly force was needed. And from what you see is that because of this law was enacted, the number of gun thefts has sharply decreased since 2005, and then it increased. Is the correct conclusion we can draw from this graph? That's the question we have. Now, let's move on to another slide. Look at carefully at this graph. This graph at top is the zero axis and at bottom is 1000. What you see is that this graph is reversed. The orientation has been reversed. And that's not usually the way graphs are created. Usually graphs are created where 0 is at the bottom in y-axis and 1000 is at the top. But what we see is that this graph has an inverted axis and is very misleading. Next, let's look at the graph on left hand side and see that what are things users should do when they create this kind of graph, or what are things that the designers should do when they create this kind of inverted graph. When they're displaying this kind of unusual graph, they should clearly mention the users that look, the 1000 is at the bottom and 0 is at the top. They should notify users such that when they read this graph, they don't draw the incorrect conclusion by reading this kind of graph. Therefore, when they read this kind of graph, they should clearly know that this is not a usual graph, and they should know that these are deviations that is from standard in this kind of graph. Moving to the next slide, what we have here is, let's talk about pie chart. Let's change our track and talk about pie chart. Pie chart is very controversial in the inner circle of data visualization, and we'll talk about the best practices of using a pie chart now. Look at this graph. If you look at this graph, what we see is that at first glance, we can see that pie chart is a great way of to show the percentages. But we'll see why we should try to avoid pie chart as much as possible in a later slide. In this slide, what we see is that the pie chart on left hand side, they are showing percentage, but the size of pie seems to be really the same for 31% and 34%. If we don't have the numbers on the pie itself. But look on the right hand side, what we see is that without having the numbers, we can see that the person B and person A have different size of bar without having percentage sign. So it is easier to look at the graph and just see that is the discern between the size of the B and size of the A just by looking at the graph. Therefore, Even though a pie chart is easier to write and looks better than a graph, the pie looks almost similar if we lack the percentage sign, and it requires a little bit more processing power to understand this graph. But if we look at this one, the bar seems to be really evident and shows the difference between percentages without needing have to have a percentage sign. Therefore, this is really a beautiful graph than the pie chart graph. Now let's quickly review what we learned today. We learned about the graph, which are deviations from the standard graphs. And when we read this graph, they are really prone to give incorrect conclusions to users. To avoid such incorrect conclusion, we are supposed to create or clearly notify the users that this graph is not a standard graph. And moving on to the pie chart is a most widely used graph, but still it has some limitations. If you're trying to show the share percentage between different groups, then it's better to use a bar graph than a pie chart graph because bar graph is easier to understand and requires less processing power than the pie chart. So that's all for today. I'll see you next learning session. Thank you so much.